class. So this week we're going to finish up with part 2, understanding racism, sexism, heterosexism, and class privilege. Alright, so first of all, let's look at how the country's wealth is divided among the population. I'm going to take a look at this video.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution, and 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are. Teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
So how different was the actual distribution of wealth compared to what you thought it was? Were you surprised by the difference? As you can see, the top 1% own 40% of all the nation's wealth compared to the bottom 80% that only has about 7% of that wealth. Let's follow up with the working poor in Dallas. So here's another video that's gonna show us what that looks like in Dallas.
Americans like to believe that with enough hard work, anyone should be able to live the American dream. But the statistics in Dallas tell a different story. So imagine if Dallas
Okay, seems like there's some issues with the video. It played earlier. I'm not sure what's going on. Let's see. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, we're gonna try this one more time.
Americans like to believe that with enough hard work, anyone should be able to live the American dream. But the statistics in Dallas tell a different story. So imagine, if Dallas were 100 people, 22 of us would be living in poverty. Of those, 1 in 10 would be impoverished despite working full-time. Dallas, meet your working poor. Who are they? Nearly 31,000 adults in Dallas are living at or below the federal poverty threshold, even though they work full-time jobs. They leave the house poor, and they come back from work just as poor. And they aren't all young workers just entering the labor force. Their median age is 36. Just under half of them are married, and 75% have children at home. The burden falls largely on women's shoulders. 18% of working poor households are headed by single moms, while only 1% are headed by single fathers. It's also an issue of ethnicity, nativity, and language. 64% of the working poor in this city are Hispanic. That's more than 50% higher than the city's overall Hispanic population. 7 out of 10 workers in poverty speak a language other than English at home. Of those, more than half can't speak English well. It's also a question of jobs and transportation. The working poor are nearly twice as likely as other workers to use transit to get to their jobs. And when they do use trains and buses to get to work, their commutes are 50% longer than workers who use transit but aren't in poverty. Dallas's working poor are just one dimension of a much broader poverty problem in Dallas. Families here are more likely to be in poverty than in any other large Texas city, and 35% of Dallas's children are impoverished. Part of that can be explained by how quickly incomes have fallen here. Median household income in Dallas is nearly $13,000 less than it was in 1969 when adjusted for inflation. In fact, Dallas has fallen behind all other major cities in Texas. This isn't the city of opportunity we know Dallas should be.
All right. Did you guys know that Dallas has the largest share of families with children that are living in poverty? And the income has also declined more than any other Texas cities. All right, so let's talk a little bit about class in America. So with the upper class, that accounts for about 1% of the population. Usually their monies are inherited wealth or referred to as old money. Salaries are not their primary source of income. Most of them have either gone to college or usually attended one of those prestigious educational institutions. New money makes up about 15% of that population's income. And this includes people whose wealth has been around for about 2 generations or so. The middle class accounts for about 34% of the population. These are working professional jobs. They have college degrees or at least some college education. They tend to be managers, doctors, lawyers, professors, even teachers. They are also referred to as white collar class. The working class accounts for about 30% of the population. They may have gone to college, but they may have more of a vocational or technical training rather than college degree. Their jobs includes electrician, carpenters, factory workers, truck drivers, police officers. These are all referred to as blue collar class. They're more likely to be members of unions, more so than people in the middle class. Their standards of living are similar, but they're not identical to the middle class. Their values, their behaviors, and even their voting trends may differ. Moving on to the poor and the working poor. So the poor and the working poor accounts for about 20% of the population. They have low educational level and they're not highly skilled. They work minimum wage jobs and even work multiple jobs without health insurance or benefits. They have no real job security. They live at or below the poverty line. So there are a few facts about the poor and the working poor. If you click on that link, you should be able to see a lot more information, but I'm just going to give you a little summary. 16.3% of women and 13.8% of men are living in poverty, so they're either part of that poor or working poor. 21.2% of children are living in poverty, while about 9.3% are seniors. When looking at the different race and how many are living in poverty, 27.6% of Native Americans live in poverty. They're followed by 26.2% blacks, 23.4% Hispanics, 12.4% white, and 12.3% Asian. So as you can see, Native Americans, blacks, and even Hispanics have like the highest poverty rate, and whites and Asians have the lowest poverty rate. Here's a little graph showing the household income tracking from 1959 all the way to 2017. So if you look at it, blacks are still at the bottom and they remain at the bottom all the way to 2017. So at the end of 2017, Asians still have the highest income, followed by whites. Next, we have all races. Hispanics are right next to blacks, which are at the bottom with 40,000 a year. Here's another graph showing the holdings of US family wealth in trillions of dollars 2000 or in trillions of 2013 dollars, and you can see the richest 10% of families at the top, followed by the families that are between that top 10% and poorest 50%, followed by the poorest 50% of all families. All right, so let's talk about the realities that the book kind of covered, 10 different realities that may be completely different from what we expect. So the first one is that there is a contrast between the rich and the poor, and this contrast is sharp. So while those are or those at the bottom of the economic ladder have fared poorly relative to those who are at the top, so have those in the middle. So about 1/3 of the U.S. population is living at either that extreme or the other. It is difficult to argue that we live in a classless society. So you're either at the extreme level of being poor or at the extreme level of being rich. Reality, too, is that the middle class in the US holds a very small share of the nation's wealth, and that share has declined steadily. So, about 85% of the population, meaning 4 out of every 5 Americans, is left sharing a little more than about 10% of the nation's wealth. There is a gap between the rich and the poor, and there is a gap between the rich and the middle class. This leaves the majority of the American population at a disadvantage. The book gives a perfect example of Samuel's Paul Samuelson's pyramid. So if you want to look at the income, the way income is distributed or who holds the most, think of it as a pyramid. So Samuelson's pyramid is done by using building blocks, and with each layer of blocks it represents $1,000. So imagine using that pyramid. it would take it would be as tall or taller than the Eiffel Tower, yet almost all of us would be left within about 6 feet of the ground. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how where the middle class falls, and how much of that wealth that they share. The income gap between the very rich, which is that 1%, and everybody else, more than tripled over the past 3 decades. Reality 3, the middle and lower income earners share a tiny portion of the nation's wealth. For the most part, the real divide in the US is between the very wealthy and everybody else, and that divide is staggering. So, about 80% of the population, 4 out of every 5 Americans, share about that 10% of that wealth. Reality 4. So, even ignoring the extreme poles of the economic spectrum, we find enormous class differences in lifestyles among the haves, the have-nots, and the have-littles. So class affects more than just our lifestyle and material well-being. It has a significant impact on our physical and mental well-being as well. The lower class standing is correlated with higher rates of infant mortality and a whole lot of other diseases, including mental illness. Research has shown that there is an inverse relationship between class and health. So people in higher class have better health. And research has also shown that the lower income correlates with lower quality of treatment for those illnesses and diseases. The higher one's class, the higher one's life expectancy as well. So people in lower class also has difficulty securing housing. They spend way more money or more money to pay for food, healthcare, and other basic necessities. And also, people in the lower class has a greater likelihood to end up as a victim of a crime. Reality number 5. So class standing accurately predicts chances for survival, educational achievement, and economic success. So, from the cradle to the grave, class position has a significant impact on our overall well being. The bottom line is that the very affluent families transmit those advantages to their next generation, and the poor families stay trapped. Students with higher social status have a higher probability that he or she will get higher grades. Class mobility is rare, and evidence shows that striking it rich is unlikely to happen. Reality 6. Class mobility in the US is lower than the rest of the industrialized world. All Americans do not have an equal opportunity to succeed. Inheritance laws provide built-in privileges to offsprings of wealthy, and they add to the likelihood of their economic success while limiting those advantages or benefits for everyone else. So benefits of a prosperous economy often goes to those who are already wealthy. And although one would think that increases in worker productivity or a booming economy would reduce the level of inequality and increase class mobility, while those wages may increase during good times or good economic times, the economic advantages of higher productivity and a booming economy go disproportionately to the wealthy. Economic downshift spread between classes. Layoffs will hit both middle and lower class. Reality number 7. Inequality in the US is persistent in good times and bad times. So, while most Americans rely on wages and salaries to make ends meet, the rich derive most of their wealth from such income producing assets like stocks, bonds, and even non-home real estate. About 89% of all stocks are owned by the wealthiest 10%. Reality 8. The privilege that accrue to the wealthy are tied to the worlds of capital and finance. So these are those worlds whose good fortune are often the misfortune of the rest of the population. It is not just that economic resources are concentrated in hands of a few, so too are political resources. So interest of the wealthy predominates in American politics. Reality 9. So wealth and power are closely linked. Class structure in the US are based on capitalism. Businesses are concerned with making profit and not meeting the needs of society. The economic elite have a grossly disproportionate amount of political power. So more than enough power to ensure that the system that provides them such extraordinary privilege perpetuates itself. These wealth brings about political power, which ensures that they will continue to gain from policies that benefit the rich. Finally, reality 10. So racism and sexism significantly compound the effects of class in society. So the issue of race and gender cuts across class lines. Although we may feel hurt and angry when someone is treating us unfairly, yet as a society we tolerate injustice. Opportunities are presented are limited based on people's race, gender, and class. Women who are poor and black are often subjected to all forces of class, race, and gender discrimination simultaneously. For instance, people do not choose to be poor or to be working class. They are just limited and confined to those opportunities that are afforded to them or that are denied to them by social and economic system. Racial and gender domination can also keep people down. So although class, race, gender can act independently of each other, they are at the same time very much interrelated. So women experience effects of sexism, whether they're well-paid professionals or poorly paid clerks. Similarly, a wealthy black man may face racial oppression. So, regardless of one's class standing, women and minority will both face the effects of racism and sexism. Here's a chart showing chances of being poor in America. So if you look closely, white male, female, if you're either a white male or female, you have a 1 in 14 chance of being poor in America. However, that chance goes up if you're a white female head of household or a Hispanic male head of household or a black male or female. Those chances are 1 in 4. And then if you are a Hispanic female head of household or a black female head of household, that chance is even higher. So it's a 1 out of 2 will be poor in America. All right, so let's talk about white privilege. I know this is a sensitive topic and sometimes it can get out of hand or people may get offended, but it's a very important topic that should be discussed. So, white privilege are the benefits, advantages, and opportunities available to people who are identified as white. These privilege can be economic, it could be cultural, it could be social, psychological, and most of the times these privileges go unnoticed, so they're not really recognized. A lot of times people don't recognize that they have access to those privileges or they're getting those privileges. So let's take a look at how white privilege works.
Taxi! Have you, or anyone that you know, ever had trouble hailing a cab? If your answer is no, then you might have white privilege. Here's how it works.
You'll see your child when you look at him. Look at David, age 9.
From the moment a white person is born, they're afforded certain privileges. While the extent and nature of their privilege varies from country to country, one thing's consistent. If you're white, society be like, you out here winning. So what's white privilege? In the words of Peggy McIntosh, a white scholar who started studying white privilege in the 1980s, white privilege is an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. In her essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, McIntosh even detailed dozens of examples of white privilege that she experiences in day-to-day life. For example, white folks are able to turn on the television and see someone who looks just like them. She even details things like being able to find band-aids that match her skin. And it works in 3 distinct ways. First, white privilege provides white people with perks. Some perks go unnoticed, like being able to actually use complimentary shampoo and conditioner at a hotel. These perks lead to a sense of entitlement because whiteness is the standard. Imagine how white women would react if hotels only carried Shea Moisture. White privilege also creates measurable advantages. A white person is more likely to be approved for loans than black folks, and that's part of what has led to disparities in home ownership. Under 42% of black folks are homeowners compared to 72% of white folks. And what about jobs? With the exception of Asian men, all groups make less than white men when we talk about median hourly earnings. This especially impacts black women. Black women make 62 cents for every dollar that white men make, and we also make 79 cents for every dollar that white women make. Not to mention that white people are able to profit off of industries that have historically penalized black folks. Just look at marijuana. According to the ACLU, the use of weed is pretty much the same among black and white people, yet black folks are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for possession. When it comes to banking off of the billion-dollar industry, black folks are shut out. About 1% of dispensary owners in the U.S. are black. Yep, that has white privilege written all over it. And folks, we're only talking about weed here. The fact that there are major disparities in incarceration rates based on race is no surprise. Finally, white privilege has pretty much come to shape everyone's view of history. Everything we've ever learned in schools, every face on our cash money, damn near every page in textbook centers white people and has been written from the white perspective. These are the faces of our nation's heroes. Why does this matter, you say? Well, white privilege literally affects everything.
Income, education, employment, incarceration, spending, housing, and even assembling.
Real talk. Do we think that a black person can protest while being armed and live to see the next day? These unearned handouts afforded to white folks are completely real, and the effects of white privilege are measurable. In the words of Damon Young, editor-in-chief of Very Smart Brothers, what white privilege means for white people is that their whiteness hasn't been a social, political, professional, financial, or legal hindrance. They have the privilege of the benefit of the doubt, which manifests as the privilege to just be. So now that you know, are we going to dismantle white privilege or not? Real talk. Real talk. Real talk. Real talk. Real talk. Real talk.
All right, so in what ways does white privilege manifest itself today? So we're going to leave this for discussion during our live session. We are having a live video session this week, so I think it'll be the perfect time to kind of have these kinds of discussion. Before we meet for a live session, I really would like you to go ahead and take the privilege test and also look over the white privilege unpacking the invisible knapsack, and then we can have that discussion when we meet over video. Other questions that I want you to think about is, do all whites benefit from white privilege, and do all whites benefit equally from white privilege? So do all whites benefit from white privilege? I would say yes. Do all whites benefit equally from white privilege? I would say no. There's different situations in which other factors may be involved where they may not benefit equally. So take a few minutes to go over the privilege test and let me know whenever we meet for a live session as to whether you're privileged or not. Okay, so we're going to end this on that note, and we will have our discussions during the live session. Have a great week.